happened to Ashkenaz, the grandson of Japheth? Who and where are his descendants today? In this session, we want to examine DNA evidence to see if a case of identity theft occurred during the Middle Ages. So we are continuing our discussion regarding the history that passed on to us from the Europeans. It was one fantastic lie, and those lies served them well. We have to go back and examine everything because names were changed, boundaries were moved, culture and identities were taken to make it seem like they were something that they were not. And as we can see, they are not going to acknowledge it. So yes, we have to bring it out. And also, if you are benefiting from this series, please like and share it, because shadow banning is a thing when you're talking about subjects many consider to be taboo. But what I need you to understand from all of this is that it is more important for us to know the truth about our history. You can stand 10 toes down when you're armed with truth. So I'm going to read some excerpts from this Atlanta Black Star article called When Black Men Rule the World, 8 Things the Moors Brought to Europe. It says, when the topic of the Moorish influence in Europe is being discussed, one of the first questions that arise is, what race were they? As early as the Middle Ages, Moors were commonly viewed as being mostly black or very swarthy, and hence the word is often used for Negro, according to the Oxford English Dictionary. Author and historian Chancellor Williams said, the original Moors, like the original Egyptians, were black Africans. And now even that is up for debate regarding the Egyptians. Here's the thing, Europeans will say that Egyptians were white Europeans, but they can't seem to make the connection to Ham. The Egyptians are descendants of Ham. So if they are Egyptians, that would mean that they are Hamites, the people they said were cursed. But let's go on. The article says the 16th century English playwright William Shakespeare used the word Moor as a synonym for African. His contemporary Christopher Marlowe also used African and Moor interchangeably. Arab writers further buttress the black identity of the Moors. The powerful Moorish emperor Yusuf bin Takfin is described by an Arab chronicler as a brown man with woolly hair. Black soldiers, specifically identified as Moors, were actively recruited by Rome and served in Britain, France, Switzerland, Austria, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. Saint Maurice, patron saint of medieval Europe, was only one of many black soldiers and officers under the employ of the Roman Empire, although generations of Spanish rulers have tried to expunge this era from the historical record. Recent archaeology and scholarship now shed fresh light on the Moors who flourished in Al-Andalus for more than 700 years, from 711 AD until 1492. And we all know what happened in 1492. So it says the Moorish advances in mathematics, astronomy, art, and agriculture helped propel Europe out of the Dark Ages and into the Renaissance. But their pride and arrogance will never allow them to admit that their knowledge came from the continent of Africa. And this is why they started burning books, destroying monuments and libraries to get rid of the evidence. They also added their name to historical documents and scientific discoveries. Why is this information important? Because you need to see the pattern Identity and cultural theft has been going on for a very long time, so it shouldn't be surprising that there are those who are trying to hide who they really are. Now we know why. So let's continue on with the article. It says the Moors brought enormous learning to Spain that over centuries would percolate through the rest of Europe. The intellectual achievements of the Moors in Spain had a lasting effect. Education was universal in Moorish Spain, while in Christian Europe, listen to this, 99% of the population was illiterate, and even kings could neither read nor write. Let that sink in. At a time when Europe had only 2 universities, the Moors had 17, located in Almeria, Cordova, Granada, Rouen, Malaga, Seville, and Toledo. In the 10th and 11th centuries, public libraries in Europe were non-existent, while Moorish Spain could boast of more than 70, including one in Cordova that housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Universities in Paris and Oxford were established after visits by scholars to Moorish Spain. It was this system of education taken to Europe by the Moors that seeded the European Renaissance and brought the continent out of the 1,000 years of intellectual and technological gloom of the Middle Ages. So let's highlight some information about the Moors, because for the most part their historical records were erased. And you already know that most of this happened when? In the Middle Ages, or better known as the Dark Ages. So this article is going to talk about the power and influence of the Moors in the Middle Ages. It says the Middle Ages, spanning from the 5th to the late 15th century, is often characterized by a series of events that laid the foundation for the modern world. Among these events, the emergence, ascendancy, and legacy of the Moors stand out as a unique and powerful episode. Hailing from the North African Maghreb, the Moors were not just conquerors, but also torchbearers of knowledge and culture. So what did the Moors look like? It says the Moors were a diverse group comprising various ethnic backgrounds, primarily Berbers, Arabs, and sub-Saharan Africans. Thus, there was no single or uniform appearance that defined the Moors. Rather, their physical characteristics would have varied widely. The Berbers, who were indigenous to North Africa, typically had lighter skin tones, varying from olive to brown, and we know that olive is brown, right? With hair ranging from wavy to curly. Their eyes were commonly brown or hazel. The Arab Moors, originating from the Arabian Peninsula, might have had similar skin tones to the Berbers, or slightly darker, with predominantly dark hair and eyes. Sub-Saharan Africans, who were part of the Moorish community, would have had darker skin tones and tightly curled hair, or woolly hair. Contemporary descriptions and artistic depictions of the Moors from the Middle Ages often portrayed them with dark or swarthy complexions. So you can't just say that the Moors were Arabs or Muslims. And just a note here that a lot of Africans and Israelites were forced to convert to Islam, much like how Israelites were forced into Christianity. Let's look at another source on that, and then we'll come back to this article. This comes from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It says Islam had already spread into northern Africa by the mid-7th century AD, only a few decades after the prophet Muhammad moved with his followers from Mecca to Medina on the neighboring Arabian Peninsula. This was 622 AD. The Arab conquest of Spain and the push of Arab armies as far as the Indus River culminated in an empire that stretched over 3 continents, a mere 100 years after the prophet's death. Between the 8th and 9th centuries, Arab traders and travelers, then African clerics, began to spread the religion along the eastern coast of Africa and to the western and central Sudan, and it was literally called Land of Black People. Now let's go back to the article and talk about the centers of learning and culture. It says one of the major contributions of the Moors was their commitment to education and the sciences. They were not only protectors of ancient knowledge, but also innovators. So it talks about Cordoba. It was the jewel of Europe. At its zenith, Cordoba was possibly the largest city in Europe and the most advanced. It boasted a library with over 400,000 books and had streets that were illuminated at night. They had the revival of classical knowledge. The Moors preserved and expanded upon the knowledge of the Greeks and Romans. And where did the Greeks and Romans get their knowledge? From the Egyptians and from the Africans. So they were translating texts into Arabic and introducing them to the region. They had innovations and discoveries. Moor scholars in astronomy, mathematics, architecture, and medicine made significant advancements. Algebra, the astrolabe, and surgical tools were just some of their innovations. This says the Moors' nearly 8 centuries of rule had a profound and lasting impact on the region's cultural landscape. It says their architecture and art are some of the most recognizable legacies of their culture, and their scholars were leaders in fields such as mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Why don't we see any of this in textbooks? It's because the barbarians who came out of the Caucasus Mountains needed a makeover. So they took on the culture and in some cases the identity of the people they conquered. Again, this may be hard for some to hear, but it's the truth. And that's why there's such a pushback against so-called Black history. They can't handle the truth. So the history was erased. Isn't it interesting that the Neanderthals just happened to disappear? The Romans disappeared. Descendants of Japheth, the Israelites, they just vanished. No, they didn't vanish. They were replaced by the Indo-Europeans. But not entirely, because the Most High reserved for himself a remnant from his people, and they're still in the lands of their captivity today. But let's talk about another group of people who just happened to disappear, the Pharisees. And I already covered their history and connection to the Idumeans in previous lessons. Most of the Pharisees were descendants of Esau. What happened to them after the sacking of Jerusalem in 70 AD? Of all the major Second Temple sects, only the Pharisees remained, and they became the founders of modern rabbinical Judaism. Imagine that. Are you making the connections? Let's look at an excerpt from a book written by Lester Grabe. It's an introduction into Second Temple Judaism, and it's talking about the Pharisees. It says perhaps more has been written on the Pharisees than any other ancient Jewish group. There are 2 reasons for this. First, they have often been seen by Jewish scholars as forerunners of rabbinic Judaism. Second, their frequent mention in the New Testament has made them a byword in many Christian writings. Neither approach is helpful because both represent a rather biased point of view. He says our task is to attempt to disentangle the Pharisees from the various sources. What soon becomes clear is how difficult the task is and how little we know for certain about them. So they didn't have a good reputation. So we see that in the Middle Ages, a lot of people groups were shuffled around and displaced while others took on their identities and their resources. So with that, we can now move into the information about Ashkenaz. Here's what we know. There are two theories regarding the mystery about Ashkenaz in Germany. We're going to look at the Rhineland hypotheses first, and then we'll look at the Khazarian hypotheses, and then you decide which one is more plausible. So here's a summary of the Rhineland hypotheses, and let's remember that a hypothesis is a theory or a guess. So I'll continue with just using AJ to refer to them as we go through this. So it says, according to the Rhineland hypotheses, the AJs descended from Jews who fled Palestine after the Muslim conquest in 638 AD. It is thought that roughly 50,000 AJs moved from the Rhineland in Germany into Eastern Europe. Yet many historians say this is impossible. It would have meant that the AJ's population exploded to 8 million from the 15th to 20th centuries. That would equal a birth rate 10 times higher than local non-AJ populations, all during a time of economic hardship, disease, and war that ravaged AJ communities. According to the Khazarian hypotheses, it says AJs descended from the Khazars, a mix of Turkish and other peoples who settled in the Caucasus in the early centuries AD. History explains the Khazars were influenced by AJ merchants, and the Khazars adopted Judaism in the 8th century. The kingdom of Khazaria came to an end in the 13th century. The now Judaized Khazars fled westward, settling in Poland and Hungary, where their skills in finance, economics, and politics were in demand. From there, these convert AJs spread into Western Europe. Now, I am going to offer the perspective from both sides. So let's look at this information from the Jewish Virtual Library and hear what they have to say about the matter. It says an international team of scientists announced on September 9, 2014, that they had come to the conclusion that all AJs are descended from an original group of about 350 individuals who lived between 600 and 800 years ago. These people were of Middle Eastern and European descent. The analysis was done by comparing the DNA data of 128 AJs with the DNA of a reference group of 26 Flemish people from Belgium, and then working out which genetic markers are unique to people of AJ descent. The similarities in the AJ's genomes allow the scientists to identify a base point from which all AJs descend. According to the scientists, this effectively makes all modern AJs 30th cousins, stemming from the same population almost 800 years ago. This discovery may help medical professionals treat genetic diseases, because diseases like Tay-Sachs and certain types of cancers are more prevalent in the AJ population. In order to treat these diseases, doctors will now have a better idea of where to sequence an individual's genome to test for disease susceptibility. This discovery also effectively disproves the idea that AJs were descended from Khazars who converted to Judaism during the 8th or 9th centuries CE. Now, what's interesting is that particular disease that they referenced in the last article is more prevalent in AJ populations. It should be common in the Levant, don't you think? Again, we're just putting pieces of the puzzle together. This says the frequency of carriers for Tay-Sachs disease in the general population is approximately 1 in 300. But in persons of AJ or French Canadian background, the frequency is high. It's at about 1 in 30. How do you explain that? Now, to get a different perspective, I want to share some excerpts from this book that was written in 1899 called The Races of Europe, a sociological study written by American economist, lecturer, and racial anthropologist William Ripley. Ripley believed that race was critical to understanding human history. So he's presenting information about race, and he came to those conclusions by connecting data in anthropology with geographical data. And he also used the cephalic index. So I want you to have an idea of what the prevailing thought was at the time this book was written. It says the struggles between Europe and Asia were extended over a period of many centuries. The Arabs challenged Europe in the south, but a far greater menace must have been the ruthless Mongolian invasions from Asia, beginning with Attila, the scourge of God, and his ruthless Huns, who actually broke through into Nordic lands, but were defeated by Aetius and Theodoric Maricine near Cologne. He goes on to talk about various invasions, and then he says, then came Genghis Khan with his Mongol horde, who conquered Hungary, Poland, and southern Russia. However, some of these invasions of yellow folk were more or less peaceful, as in the case of the great empire of the Khazars. These later adopted Judaism, even as the Asiatic settlers in the Balkans had accepted Christianity. Here he talks about the AJs, and he says, for the most part, they are congregated within the ghetto of Poland, but they have spread all over Europe. He says there's a vast difference racially as well as culturally between the AJ gentry and the ghetto types. And then he says, suffice it to say here that the more progressive Jews of Western Europe, the Sephardim Jews, are probably the descendants of the true Jews, while the AJs or ghetto Jews are at least in part the descendants of converts to Judaism under the old Khazar Empire. Now let's do some digging. So I'll share some excerpts from this article from academia.edu, and it's talking about the migration of the AJs from Germany to Poland. It's the Rhineland hypotheses revisited. It says by the 16th century, there was already a substantial AJ population residing in Eastern Europe, which spoke Yiddish, and they followed the Ish rituals modeled on those of the Ish population of Germany. It has consequently been assumed by many historians that Eastern European Jewry originated in a migration of AJs from Germany prior to that century, fleeing the pogroms of the First Crusade, the pestilence of the Black Death, or the expulsions of the 15th century. The author examines the historical evidence for such migrations, but concludes that no major migration to Poland appears to have taken place as a result of these three events. It says the data in Germania Judaica, plus the inability of historians to produce evidence regarding substantial migrations from Germany to Poland make it clear that mass migrations from Germany to Poland during the periods investigated cannot be proven. The lack of evidence makes the Rhineland hypotheses unlikely as far as migrations are concerned. Moreover, the finding of the wooden hanger with the Hebrew inscription in the town hall of Cologne, dated 1427, is clear evidence that expulsion from the country did not take place. So, the author says, I should point out that I am certainly not the first one to disagree with the idea that East European Jewry is based on the migrations from Germany. And he comes to a conclusion based on these three things. He says, during the First Crusade and the plague, the AJs of Germany did not migrate to Poland. Secondly, during the expulsions in the 15th century, the AJs were not expelled from Germany and did not migrate en masse to Poland. Remarks about Germany being Judenrein at the end of the Middle Ages are speculation. Third, it says the Rhineland hypothesis is not tenable when it has to rely on mass migrations of AJs during the Crusades, the plague, or the expulsions. The DNA research shared by Science Daily says many of the maternal ancestors of modern AJs were European converts, according to new research. Analysis of data samples has shown that on the female line, the AJs are descended not from the Near East, but from Southern and Western Europe. The study says it was discovered that in the vast majority of cases, AJ lineages are most closely related to those of Southern and Western Europe, and that they had been present in Europe for many thousands of years. This suggests that even though Jewish men may indeed have migrated into Europe from Palestine around 2,000 years ago, they seem to have married European women. The question is, who were those men? Were they Idumeans? So it says this seems to have happened first along the Mediterranean, especially in Italy, and later, but probably to a lesser extent in Western and Central Europe. This suggests that in the early years of the diaspora, Judaism took in many converts from amongst the European population, but they were mainly recruited from amongst women. Thus, on the female line of descent, the AJs primarily trace their ancestry neither to Palestine nor to Khazaria in the North Caucasus, as has also been suggested, but to Southern and Western Europe. Commenting on the study regarding AJs being genetically Europeans, we have this excerpt from co-author Martin Richards, an archaeogeneticist at the University of Huddersfield in England, and this is what he had to say. He said, though the finding may seem intuitive, it contradicts the notion that European Jews mostly descend from people who left Israel and the Middle East around 2,000 years ago. Instead, a substantial proportion of the population originates from local Europeans who converted to Judaism. So let's go back to the study from Frontiers in Genetics, and I covered a portion of this last time regarding the origins of the AJs and their language. And the study was done by professors and researchers from various places, from India, from Tel Aviv, from Johns Hopkins, as well as in the United Kingdom. So the researchers compared the two hypotheses, and then they addressed the major questions regarding the origin of the term Ashkenaz, the origin of the AJs, and the origin of Yiddish. The first question was in regards to the term or the name Ashkenaz. They found that there are 4 villages in northeastern Turkey whose names resemble that name, and at least one of the villages predates any major AJ settlement in Germany. Next, they looked at the ancestral origin of the AJs, and the results show that they exhibit high genetic similarity to populations living in Turkey and the Caucasus. Next, they looked at when they arrived to German lands. They found that the AJs migrated to Europe as a result of trade routes going west and then later through Khazar lands. The next question pertained to the language. It said Yiddish came about as the result of an inferred admixture between 960 and 1416 AD. That puts it in the Middle Ages. The report says at that time AJs were speculated to have absorbed Slavic people, developed Slavic Yiddish, and intensified their migration to Europe. And finally, they answer the question about the growth of the Eastern European AJs and determined that most of the AJs were in northeastern Turkey, and the remaining individuals clustered along a gradient going from Turkey to Eastern European lands. It says this is in agreement with the recorded conversion of populations living along the southern shores of the Black Sea. So another source basically saying that they converted to Judaism. Now, the one thing I liked about the study is that it didn't just focus on one area. It looked at genetics, the language, the migration patterns, and the connection to the name Ashkenaz. Now, tie all of that into the data about the skull measurements, early writings about the description of the ancient Israelites, and what Scripture says about the curses that would be on the people and where they would be in the last days. They're supposed to be on the bottom and still living in the lands of their captivity. So it's not adding up. So these scholars debunked the Rhineland hypotheses as to how the AJs just happened to be using the name Ashkenaz. They say the Rhineland hypotheses cannot explain why a name that denotes Scythians and was associated with the Near East became associated with German lands in the 11th to 13th centuries. So Aptroot suggested that Jewish immigrants in Europe transferred biblical names onto the regions in which they settled. But it says this is unconvincing because biblical names were used as place name only when they had similar sounds. Not only Germany and Ashkenaz do not share similar sounds, but Germany was already named Germana or Germamja in the Iranian or Babylonian Talmud completed in the 5th century AD, and, not surprisingly, was associated with Noah's grandson Gomer. So it says name adoption also occurred when the exact place names were in doubt, as in the case of Sepharad, speaking about Spain. It says this is not the case here, as Aptroot 2 notes, since Ashkenaz had a known and clear geographical affiliation. Finally, Germany was known to French scholars like the Radak as Almania, after the Almani tribes, a term that was also adopted by Arab scholars. It says, had the French scholar Rashi interpreted Ashkenaz as Germany, it would have been known to the Radak who used Rashi's symbols. The findings show that the genetic structure of the AJ are genetically closest to Turkic, Southern Caucasian, and Iranian populations. Now, I know that they push back on the information, but a lot of the rebuttal is just not consistent with most of the findings. So they're saying that thus far all analysis aimed to geolocalize AJs point to Turkey as the predominant origin of the AJs. The Conversation published this article in 2018 saying, AJ's mysterious origins unraveled by scientists thanks to ancient DNA. And it's saying, for a more scientific take on the AJ origin debate, recent DNA analysis of AJs reveal that their maternal line is European. It has also been found that their DNA only has 3% ancient ancestry, which links them with the Eastern Mediterranean, also known as the Middle East. So it says this is the part of the world AJs are said to have originally come from according to the Old Testament, but 3% is a minuscule amount and similar to what modern Europeans as a whole, listen, share with Neanderthals. So given that the genetic ancestry link is so low, AJ's most recent ancestors must be from elsewhere. Now, we have to look at the AJ's connection to the ancient Israelites. What's the connection? They say it's the bloodline connection of the mother. Funny thing is, this goes against scripture. The lineage is traced through the father. In addition, if we use the maternal line, 2 of the tribes are illegitimate. I'm speaking about Manasseh and Ephraim. Their mother was Egyptian. The Egyptians are Hamites. So how do you reconcile that? Folks, there are just too many loose ends here with no plausible explanation. So I'll share this information from the Times of Israel. It's talking about the maternal bloodline versus paternal bloodline. The article says, according to halakha or Jewish law, if your mother is Jewish, you are considered Jewish, whereas if only your father is Jewish, you are considered non-Jewish. So the author is asking, who decided that? It's an interesting question to pursue because the very source of all we know concerning Judaism can be traced back to the Bible. Oddly enough, though, according to the Jewish scriptures, the ethnicity or lineage was it was passed down through the father and not the mother. And then they cite the case of Joseph. So what's their explanation for that? Shay D. Cohen, professor of Hebrew literature and philosophy at Harvard, offers his take on why this happened. One of his theories is that rabbis who codified the concept of matrilineal descent were influenced by the Roman legal system of the time. Say what? It says during those times, late 2nd to early 3rd century, the father's status would prevail if the marriage occurred between 2 Romans. However, in the case of intermarriage, the child would take on the citizenship of the mother. Another of his theories emanates from the animal kingdom and mixed breeding. The thought is that the Torah prohibits the breeding of animals of different species. So is this a reference to Neanderthals? I don't know. Let's go on and see. Which led to an opinion in the Mishnah that the animal may be mated with the breed of the maternal species. Cohen, however, only offers these two theories speculatively and does not conclusively state that either of the two are definitively the cause for the change. So in other words, there's no answer for that. The thing though, they're trying to prove legitimacy from 4 women, which is not how it was traced in the Torah. And now the studies are saying that those 4 women were converts. So by their own admission and tradition, that makes them Europeans, because they took on the heritage of the mother, not the father. This article from Haaretz says study traces AJ's roots to European women who probably converted to Judaism. They converted to a religion. That didn't change the bloodline. The maternal lineage leads back to Japheth, not Shem. I think the answer is right in front of us. We're looking at the maternal DNA to prove legitimacy for the AJs in this situation, as well as with the children born to the Nephilim. It's the maternal line that made those children human. The seed did not come from Adam. And this is another piece of the puzzle, because descendants of the ancient Israelites belonged to a father's house. That's how they trace their lineage. We are the seed of Jacob. So I've presented a lot of information here so that you can come to a conclusion. But if this message has been a blessing to you, please hit the like and share it. You're also welcome to subscribe if you have not already done so. We normally upload messages on Sunday mornings at 8:30 a.m. Yah willing. Join me next time.